just want to pick up on where we left off on Sunday with some of the contentious verses that we stopped right before. You see, the Apostle Paul in this letter, he says some of the most controversial words, and I thought it would be a good idea for us to just pause and talk about them, because the truth is they're not easy, and they raise a difficult question about whether or not women should be leaders and teachers in the church. Now, this particular issue, I got to tell you, it's been a sore spot for a long time, and the cause of entire church and denomination of churches to split. And so I don't want to take it too lightly. However, I do want to communicate crystal clear. Where you land on the issue of women in leadership is irrelevant to the central message of the gospel that Paul wants people to know. Paul communicated this at the beginning of his letter. Jesus gave his life so that all people could be saved. And now we're just trying to learn to live and love like him. And so with that, let's start by, we're going to read this passage, and I'm going to offer you just 3 quick points of view, the pros and the cons of each of those views, and then we'll kind of wrap it up together with hopefully some guidance on where I sit and maybe what you can do. Verse 11, a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, and then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing, if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. So, for obvious reasons, I'm sure you can tell, this passage has caused a number of problems, and it raises all kinds of questions, some of which are answerable and some of which are just not. Verse 11 can be set aside, though, pretty quickly as non-offensive, and let me help with that. Quieting down and submitting yourself to an authority is how everyone learns. It's not offensive for Paul to tell women to learn that way. In fact, it's the exact opposite of that. It's liberating. It's actually countercultural for the Jewish Christians in the city of Ephesus, because Jewish women up until that point weren't typically permitted to learn with the men at all. The fact that Paul encourages these women to learn it's a massive, massive break with tradition for the role and the place of women. But I get, man, it's really hard to figure out what to do with those next few verses. I don't permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. I mean, she must be quiet. So here are my 3 points of view and their pros and their cons. First, what I would call the ridiculous point of view. And if you think that's being a little bit harsh, well, just listen. Here's the point of view number 1. We call it the ridiculous one. Women should not be teachers and leaders in the church because there's something about being a woman that makes you more easily deceived, something inherent to her biology that causes women to be more easily tricked. Now, what are the pros to that? Well, that point of view does seem to follow the text directly. I mean, Paul says that Eve was the one who was deceived, not Adam. So there you have it. Because women are more easily deceived, they shouldn't be teachers. Now, the cons, and the reason I think this is a ridiculous point of view, is that it raises a really significant question that Paul is actually going to flip-flop on in the very next few verses in chapter 3. If women can't be teachers because they're easily deceived, then what does that say about Adam? If Eve was tricked into sin, Adam knowingly stepped into it. So those who are easily duped should not be teachers, but those who knowingly do wrong should be? Well, that doesn't really seem to make any logical sense. Plus, in the next few verses, in the very next chapter, Paul's going to reverse that idea by saying that leaders and teachers have to be people of high moral character and virtue. I mean, all of that leads me to kind of toss this first view out. Although I appreciate that it's taking Paul at its word, I'm pretty sure there are not many people who would like to stand up and espouse the idea that women are more easily deceived and therefore should not be teachers. That's just not something anybody I can imagine would stand by. Now, the second point of view is what I would call the creation explanation. The second explanation is that this point of view, says that God established roles as a result of the sort of created order. Because God created Adam and then Eve, Adam and Eve's roles are then different. There's no difference in their value or their importance to the community. They both are, but simply a distinguishing of roles. Now, I appreciate this point of view for the way that it also seems to remain really faithful to the text. I mean, Paul clearly states that women will find satisfaction carrying out their roles, and the assumption is that the men will also carry out their role. The creation explanation then would want to emphasize that while men and women have equal standing before God, their roles are just different. And they're just different because they were created in a different order. Now, the trouble with this is that Paul doesn't really seem to communicate this idea of men only teaching universally. He seems to have no problem, for example, assigning a woman named Priscilla, a fellow tent maker of his, actually, a Jewish convert to Christianity. He has no problem assigning her to the role of teaching Apollos how to be a better teacher and preacher. Paul also doesn't seem to have a problem with Phoebe being the one to read the letter to the churches in Rome and more than likely expound on them and explain them and teach them to people. He also doesn't seem to have a problem with Chloe being a leader of a house church in Corinth, and a little later in this letter, he's going to instruct other women to teach younger women. So it seems a little bit inconsistent to think that Paul forbids all women everywhere to teach and lead the church, which kind of leads us to our final point of view. And while I do like these last 2 points of view, this one is not also without its holes. I would call this last point of view the cultic explanation. This explanation would say that Paul's instructions here are unique to the church's situation in Ephesus, that Timothy is dealing with. That, remember, he's dealing with a lot of false teachers and misinformation going on in the congregations on matters of faith and spirituality. It's already a big problem that people are teaching the wrong things. And secondly, the city of Ephesus, like we said on Sunday, was home to a few female-only led cults. Oh, hey, buddy. Every member, priest, leader in those cults, like the cult of Artemis, was a woman. And so some of those women would have no doubt joined the church, and so it becomes an interesting question once they do, when everything about your religious experience up until this point has been having women lead. You kind of might assume that this new Jesus-following religion would also have women lead. The trouble for Paul, though, is that the new converts from the pagan religions, that he doesn't think they should lead because they haven't learned. And the female Jewish converts shouldn't teach and lead either because they haven't learned. That's why Paul tells them to learn in quietness and submission. So while everyone might assume in the city of Ephesus that women would take over and lead, Paul disagrees, and rightfully so. If you haven't learned, you shouldn't lead. That's why Paul says, I don't permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. Because everybody assumed women would lead over men because of the cultic context. But Paul's saying, look, we've already got a problem with false teachers and people teaching the wrong thing. We're not going to add uneducated teachers and leaders into the mix. That'll just make things worse. Now, the reason Eve was deceived, this third point of view would say, was because she hadn't learned God's rules directly. She only got them from Adam, kind of a hodgepodge version. And clearly she didn't understand them correctly, because what she says to the snake is not the same as what God said to Adam about the tree. Now, what it comes down to is that those who haven't learned for Paul, they shouldn't lead in Ephesus, because they've already got a problem with misinformation. Now, I like the creation explanation, and I really like the cultic explanation. However, this cultic explanation, like the others, is not without its problems. If Paul just meant that people who haven't learned shouldn't lead, then that seems pretty simple. Why didn't he just say that? Why go to all the trouble to sort of cryptically explain through a veiled Old Testament reference your idea about men and women? Also, it seems like it takes a lot of theological gymnastics to understand his reference to Adam and Eve, and it doesn't really ever address the last line about women being saved in childbearing or child rearing. So it's not without its problems. So the question is, what do we do? I mean, each explanation has good parts and each explanation has troubles, so maybe I can offer some help. First, We should always recognize when reading old texts that Paul is writing to a particular people in a particular place in a particular time, and to assume that he or they should live by all of the same sensibilities as us in the 21st century, I mean, that's outrageous, and it's kind of arrogant if you think about it. I mean, people 100 years from now are going to look at some of the things that we insist on today, and they're just going to laugh, just like we often do to the people who have gone before us. So what we should do is not assume that Paul's immediately trying to tell us something, but that we should actually wonder, how would this text have been understood by its original readers in Ephesus? The second thing we should do is always look at the context of a biblical passage. I mean, what's going on in this letter as a whole? What's the point of the entire section? How does it fit with what was written right before it, or how does it fit with what was written right after it? I mean, it seems like Paul's talking a lot about character coming from your conduct and not from your outward appearance. So we got to fit in with the context. And the last thing we need to do is ask the question, how does this fit with what we know about Jesus? I mean, Jesus had both male and female followers, but his 12 disciples were all men. So what was the historical context? What was the literary context? And how does it square with Jesus? And finally, because all of this is so difficult and it's not central to the gospel message, we hold it loosely. We honor the people who differ in their opinion from us, knowing that, look, this is just not an essential teaching of Scripture, nor is it core to the message of the gospel. And so I guess I'll kind of leave you with that to wonder and come to your own conclusion as you study the Bible and read. But if it helps, here's where I'm at. I think I land on the third option because I don't think Paul was writing to us as first century audience, or really anyone else in the first century. I think the best explanation is the one that does the most justice to the historical context. And so for me, that's option number 3. But the truth is, I hold it loosely because I see the problems and the unknowns with it. And then I try to rest on what I do know. And here's what I do know. I know that Paul instructed Apollos to be taught by Priscilla and her husband, a female Jewish convert, and that didn't seem to be an issue. I know that Phoebe read and more than likely explained Paul's letter to the churches in Rome. I know that Chloe had a leadership role, hosting a church in her home in Corinth and keeping regular correspondence with Paul on how things were going. The very first preacher I know was a woman. The very first preacher of the resurrection, was a woman, Mary Magdalene. And Jesus invited one of his friends, Mary, the sister of Martha, to learn at his feet along with the other disciples. But perhaps you remember the story. Martha was busy in the kitchen, and Mary was sitting at the feet of Jesus trying to learn. You know, we often confuse that story, thinking Mary was just sitting at the feet of Jesus, staring up at him like a doe-eyed schoolgirl, just gazing into his eyes in some sort of raptured state. But that's not really the case. Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet learning like the rest of the disciples. And when Martha confronted Jesus on it, Jesus said that that's where Mary belonged, at his feet, learning with the others whom he was training to be preachers and teachers. So to me, the evidence points to Paul addressing a specific situation, a problem in Ephesus. And therefore, the restriction of women from teaching and leading is not a universal directive. However, I do see the other side of the argument as well. I mean, Paul definitely was not interested in some sort of feminist female liberation movement. But he also wasn't interested in propagating a system that kept women down either. He was interested in preaching the gospel and seeing more and more people know that Jesus came to give his life for all of them. And so I focus on that. And I hold the rest a little more loosely. Now, as we move forward, we are going to see this, especially on Sunday. Paul is going to speak for the next 2 chapters about leadership, but he's going to speak about it in male terms. But of course, in the Ephesian setting, you've got to understand that makes perfect sense. Because at this point in the Ephesian church's development, if you haven't learned, you shouldn't lead. And the women of Ephesus, coming out of pagan religions and out of Jewish religions, they just simply haven't learned, and so they should not be leaders, only the men will. And to me, since this series is all about leading a legacy and how to live well when life's not going well, in this passage, that really does seem to be the overarching principle that I think you and I should draw out. It's not about a universal rule about men and women. It's this. If you haven't learned, you shouldn't lead. Let me say that again. If you haven't learned, you shouldn't lead. We've got enough misinformation going on in the world that you and I live in today. Thanks to the internet, plenty of people without any knowledge whatsoever have the platform to speak and preach and espouse all kinds of things. And unfortunately, lots of people listen. And as Christians, I think we should be careful with that. First of all, we should be ready to listen to those who have learned and follow their lead. And if we ourselves aspire to be leaders, then we should do our hard work and be diligent to learn before we attempt to lead anything. And to me, that's the takeaway for how to live well, especially when life's not going well. If you want to lead, do the work to learn. And if you haven't learned, don't lead in that area. All right, we'll pick up on chapter 3, verse 1 on Sunday. See you then.